Friends, the time has come to speak of magic. And I'm not merely speaking of the magic of our existence, the magic of love, or the magic of a perfectly made sandwich. No, I'm talking about magic as an art form, the craft of professional magicians. This is different from the magic allegedly possessed by shamans, priests, prophets, oracles, and other religious figures from throughout history. That kind of magic is prehistoric. No, what we're talking about here is magic as entertainment, magic as performance art. While maybe not quite as old as the magic of the shamans, this type of magic does have an impressively ancient pedigree. There are Egyptian hieroglyphs dating from the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh to whom the Great Pyramid of Giza is dedicated, that seem to show a magic show being enjoyed by the pharaoh and his sons. The point is that magical performance seems to be as ancient as theater itself. This means that starting a story about the history of magic presents some difficulties. Where to begin? Well, perhaps a good place to start is with a man who's been called the father of modern stage magic, Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. This French conjurer has been credited with making magic respectable in the 19th century. In fact, if you do a quick search for Houdin's name, you might even read that he was the magician who popularized wearing a formal coat with tails and a top hat on stage. Before Houdin, most European magicians wore colorful costumes. Some dressed as wizards, others would wear their idea of an Indian turban, playing on the stereotype that there was no place more magical than the mysterious East. Houdin insisted that he was the first to perform exclusively in fine European evening wear. So, it's possible that when you draw a cartoon of a magician with his top hat and tails, you're essentially drawing Robert Houdin. Houdin's memoir is one of the more beloved books in the history of magic, and by all accounts, it inspired countless young magicians who were swept away by Houdin's amazing life story. In his memoir, Houdin tells his readers that he was the son of a clockmaker in Blois, France. His father had hoped that his academically inclined son might pursue law as a career and help his family move up in the world. But the young Houdin had no interest in law and found he was far more fond of his father's clockwork arts. So he went into the family business and became a clockmaker. Then, one day, by chance, while buying a book on clockwork mechanics, the bookseller accidentally slipped him an illustrated dictionary of what were called, quote, scientific amusements. This was essentially a book filled with magical secrets, including diagrams of machines, rigged boxes, and other stage gear used by magicians to help accomplish their amazing feats. Robert Houdin became obsessed. Magic was calling him. Soon he was attending every fair he could to catch the magic acts. At one such fair, he made the mistake of eating something a little sketchy from one of the concession stands, and he came down with a brutal case of food poisoning. A danger of fairs that, in my experience, really has not changed in 150 years. Watch out what you're getting from those stands in the small town fairs, friends. Houdin would later write that he was so delirious from food poisoning that he actually threw himself from the carriage that was taking him home, and he landed in a ditch with his head spinning. Houdin couldn't remember how long he laid in that ditch, and he very well may have died there. But just then, at that crucial moment, he was saved. Seemingly out of nowhere, a kindly old man appeared and offered him a cup of water. The old man then helped the young Houdin out of the ditch and brought him back to the fair, where the Good Samaritan proceeded to nurse him back to health. The old man was a magician who performed in the fair as the Great Torini. As Houdin steadily recovered his strength, he asked his magician savior everything he could about his act. While reticent at first, the old magician soon found himself charmed by this enthusiastic young man. It was clear that Houdin had already been studying the magical arts. Torini was convinced that this young man that he'd found in a ditch was actually a sincere student of the craft, not simply some cheeky audience member looking to get some attention by publicly embarrassing a magician by revealing his secrets. So, even after Houdin had fully recovered from his bout of food poisoning, he returned to the fair as often as possible to learn everything he could from the old man. As trust built between the two, Torini not only revealed the secrets of his illusions, but also the secret of his past. Torini, of course, was not his real name. He was, in fact, Count Edmond de Grisi, and a generation earlier, he had been one of Europe's most successful stage magicians. In the early 19th century, Count de Grisi had toured Europe and performed in front of some of the most august audiences of the age. De Grisi was said to have performed in front of Pope Pius VII at the Vatican, where he smashed a cardinal's prized pocket watch only to return it to him magically restored. Some magic historians writing in the late 19th century even credited Count de Grisi with performing the first ever illusion where a woman was sawed in half. But as the young Houdin would learn, de Grisi's story was ultimately tragic. One of the Count's signature illusions was something called the Son of William Tell, which he performed with his teenage son Giovanni. It was essentially a twist on the old bullet catch routine. In the William Tell legend, a man is given a chance to win his freedom by shooting an apple off the head of his son with an arrow. In the de Grisi illusion, a volunteer from the audience would aim a pistol at an apple placed in Giovanni's mouth. The Count was always amazed at just how readily a complete stranger would pick up what they believed was a loaded weapon and point it at his teenage son's head and pull the trigger. Each time the gun would fire, Giovanni's head would dramatically jerk back, and he would be fine. Then the apple would be examined. The audience would marvel as Giovanni displayed the bullet hole in the apple, and then they would burst into applause when the apple was cut open to show the bullet lodged neatly inside. The secret to this trick was relatively simple. The gun was loaded with blanks. With a little sleight of hand and misdirection, the undamaged original apple was swapped with a pre-rigged apple with a bullet already inside. They performed this feat all over the continent, and soon de Grisi and Giovanni were arguably the best-known stage magicians in Europe. Until one fateful day, while performing in France, the unimaginable happened. Somehow, a real bullet found its way into the barrel of the gun. The audience volunteer pulled the trigger, and Giovanni was shot between the eyes. He flopped to the ground and died instantly. The shocked de Grisi let out a horrifying scream and threw himself on the body of his son. He was so inconsolable that we're told that a mob had to forcefully pry him off of Giovanni's body. If that tragedy hadn't been heartbreaking enough, the legal proceedings that followed only served to salt the wound. The French courts determined that Count de Grisy was legally liable for the death of his son. He was found guilty of, quote, homicide through imprudence, end quote, and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. When he was finally released, the de Grisy name had been ruined. The death of Giovanni and his ensuing imprisonment had left Count de Grisy with few friends. One of the only people who still had room in his heart for this broken man was de Grisy's brother-in-law, Antonio. He did his best to console the still grieving de Grisy, and he suggested that he start performing magic again. One of his great joys in life had been magic. If he was going to keep on living, then de Grisy needed to perform. Well, the old count agreed, although he knew that he would never again be able to perform under his old name. So he took the name Torini and started performing small magic shows in fairs and touring carnivals. It wasn't much, but it kept him going. But when Torini came across the feverish Robert Houdin in a ditch, he realized that it was his duty to help him recover. When Houdin showed an interest in magic, Torini saw it as an act of penance to teach this eager young man everything he knew. And so he did. The young Robert Houdin traveled with Torini for at least 2 months, absorbing everything he could about the old man's craft. Houdin even started creating illusions of his own, using his know-how as a clockmaker to design miraculous-seeming clockwork contraptions and automatons for the act. Their time together came to its head when one night an ailing Torini felt too sick to go on stage. Houdin, now confident that he could perform his master's act, disguised himself as the old magician and went on stage as Torini. In the memoirs, he admits that the performance was sloppy and lacked much of the grace possessed by the elder Torini, but it wasn't bad for a first show. After that, Robert Houdin felt like he was ready to strike out on his own, and so he said a final goodbye to Torini. In his memoir, he would write, quote, "The moment of our separation had arrived, and my old friend had been arming himself for it during several days. The parting was painful for us all. A father quitting his son without hope of ever seeing him again could not have displayed more violent grief than did Torini when pressing me in his arms for the last time. I too felt inconsolable." End quote. Perhaps in that final moment, Torini had finally forgiven himself for the loss of his son. In Robert Houdin, he had a new son, or at least a man who would truly honor his legacy. Tragedy had been transformed into catharsis. The story of Torini and Robert Houdin is almost too perfect. It hits virtually all the beats of a well-constructed hero's journey tale. Torini seems more like an archetype than a real person. He's Obi-Wan Kenobi, a troubled but gifted mentor, one who the hero must learn from, but ultimately needs to leave behind and transcend. It was a story that certainly resonated with a young Jewish American named Eric Weiss. As a young man, Weiss was enchanted by magician Robert Houdin, and he read his memoir cover to cover a number of times. Weiss's friend, Jacob Hyman, was equally taken with the exploits of Houdin, and so it was decided that the two young men would start a magic act together. They would call themselves the Brothers Houdini, and Eric Weiss would soon be known the world over as Harry Houdini. Now, there are a number of different stories about how they concocted the name. Weiss himself would write that they took the name Houdin, which, not knowing French, they mispronounced as Houdin, and then added an I because they thought that suffix suggested something like Houdin-like or Little Houdin. However, magician Jim Steinmeier has suggested that the name was likely a combination of Houdin and Houdini. The brothers Houdini performed as a duo before Jacob joined the American Army in the mid-1890s. While Hyman served his country, his former partner continued to perform as Harry Houdini. Ironically, it was probably Jacob Hyman who first came up with the name. But it was Harry who would make Houdini immortal. Now, for years, Harry Houdini idolized Robert Houdin. But he eventually became disenchanted with his hero. As his own star started to rise, Houdini became convinced that Houdin had actually stolen a number of his most impressive stage illusions from other magicians and had not given them proper credit. These suspicions eventually led to Houdini penning a book-length exposé of his namesake called The Unmasking of Robert Houdin. One of the things Houdini found most upsetting was that his research revealed that Houdin's memoir was filled with lies. Houdini wasn't even sure by the end of it that Robert Houdin had written it himself. In fact, he accused the old magician of using an unnamed Parisian journalist as a ghostwriter. Houdini also noticed that the author had incorrectly explained how many classic acts of stage magic were performed. This wasn't the work of a master. These were the ramblings of a hack. On top of all that, Houdini discovered that Robert Houdin hadn't even been the first magician to wear a tux and tails on stage. He credited a Prussian magician, Vijalba Frickel, as the first to take the stage in the clothes of a gentleman. Houdini was right to suspect that Robert Houdin's memoirs should not be trusted. But he didn't discover the most bold deception of them all. Decades after Houdini's death, researchers into the history of magic, among them the previously mentioned Jim Steinmeier, discovered that Robert Houdin's famous mentor, Torini, never actually existed. Houdin made him up. There is no evidence outside of Houdin's memoir that a man named Count de Grisi ever performed magic. There is certainly no evidence that a young man died on stage while performing a bullet catch illusion in the early 19th century. And that's the kind of thing that would have made the papers. If, like me, you thought that the whole Torini story was just a little too perfect, well, that's because it is. There was no Torini. He didn't perform for the Pope. He was not the first person to cut a woman in half. He didn't live. He was an entirely fictional character cooked up by Robert Houdin. And yes, it was Houdin holding the pen. For all of Houdini's research into his master, his accusation about a ghostwriter was entirely unfounded. Robert Houdin's entire autobiography was a magic trick, an entertaining deception that gets the audience to believe the unbelievable. It was effective, too. Biographers and historians of magic would continue to write about Torini as if he was a real person well into the 20th century. In fact, right now, in 2022, if you Google Torini, the first few hits will direct you to sources that speak of him as a real person, the mentor of Robert Houdin, the first magician to saw a woman in half. If we trust Houdini's writing, he was crushed when he discovered that his mentor had not been what he seemed. He was personally offended by the illusion that had been created by his former hero. But Harry Houdini should have known better. Because magicians are liars. They're professional liars. Houdini himself was one of the most spectacular liars ever to take the stage. If you take a look at the life of Eric Weiss, the man we call Harry Houdini, you will find no shortage of myths, misdirections, and overt deceptions concerning his own life story, many of them concocted by the magician himself. But Houdini had an interesting personal philosophy when it came to the truth. He believed that there was a moral and an immoral way to lie. Houdini fancied himself a moral liar, and he dedicated many years of his life to exposing those who would use the liar's toolkit for immoral ends. But if you go hunting for the truth about Houdini, you may find yourself led astray by flashy distractions, tripped up by trapdoors, and swept away by the story being told by the man on stage. Houdini was shocked when he discovered that the life story of his hero was little more than a myth. But what about Houdini's own life story? How much of that can really be trusted? Can we ever know anything for sure about a magician? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 168, Who Knows Houdini, Part 1. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Was that the longest intro we've ever done? I think it might be, but you know what? There were too many good stories in there not to just keep going. So, you know what? I like a hefty intro. Deal with it. Before we get going this week, this is just a reminder that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and start supporting at $5 a month or more to get access to an ad-free feed and all the other awesome extra content that we have on offer. Coming very, very soon is a new extra episode where I will be giving you all of my thoughts on the Graham Hancock Netflix series, Ancient Apocalypse. That will be available to everyone supporting at $3 or more on Patreon. So patrons, keep your eyes open for that. This week, we are starting a new series on history's best known stage magician, Harry Houdini. Now, normally I would qualify a statement like that. I would hedge my bets by saying the late 19th century's best known magician, or the best known magician of the vaudeville era. But in this case, I don't think I need to do that. The name Houdini is synonymous with magic. Sometimes you'll hear of a great athlete who has transcended their sport. Muhammad Ali was bigger than boxing. Michael Jordan was bigger than basketball. I think in the same way, Houdini is bigger than magic. Now, that's not to say that Houdini was the best magician. In the world of magic, like in the world of sports or music, or really anything, there's a healthy debate around who the GOAT truly is. Jim Steinmeier, one of magic's great designers and a historian of the craft, has described Houdini as second-rate, at least when it came to orchestrating large stage illusions. After all, Houdini is best remembered as an escape artist. And to some, this puts him in a slightly different category from magicians who create illusions through sleight of hand or stagecraft. Now, that's not to say that Houdini didn't perform stage illusions or employ sleight of hand and other classic techniques of magic. He did. He was the man who famously made an elephant disappear. But it was his daring escapes from handcuffs, straitjackets, milk cans, and water tanks that truly made him an icon. Now, these days, the word icon gets thrown around pretty loosely. The internet has basically just turned the word iconic into clickbait. Was the episode of Friends where Ross first said, "We were on a break," really iconic? Was a 2008 Vanity Fair photo shoot featuring the cast of Twilight really iconic? I mean, look, I don't want to sound like a pedantic old fogey here, but maybe we need a slightly higher bar for what qualifies as iconic. But Harry Houdini, like Michael Jordan, like Muhammad Ali, earns the status of icon. Because an icon is a symbol that represents something more than itself. The name Houdini can stand in for the ideas of escape, liberation, and achieving the impossible. How many other celebrities from the turn of the 20th century can still claim to have that level of name recognition? Whether or not Houdini was technically the best magician in the eyes of the magical cognoscenti is beside the point. He was able to achieve something with his art that stuck in the popular consciousness. His performances were so magnetic and his image was so captivating that to this day, almost every magician lives in Houdini's shadow. But for all his fame, Houdini remains a bit of an enigma. Like so many people, he was a mass of contradictions. He was a professional liar who later in life went on a righteous crusade against those who would deceive. In his 1908 book, The Unmasking of Robert Houdin, he wrote furiously about his disenchantment and sense of betrayal when he learned that his hero's life story had been little more than a carefully curated set of myths. And as a quick aside here, I'm sure some of the film buffs in the crowd may have noticed that many of the details from Houdin's autobiography that I used in the introduction were repurposed for the Christopher Nolan film about rival magicians, The Prestige. And if you have not seen The Prestige, oh my God, please treat yourself. It may be one of my all-time favorite movies. David Bowie plays Tesla. I mean, give me a break. Go, watch The Prestige. Enjoy. Anyway, many have pointed out that Houdini was perhaps being a little hypocritical when he wrote his scathing exposé of Robert Houdin. In fact, it's almost become a cliché among Houdini experts to say that Houdini may have been projecting a little in his criticisms of Houdin, because Houdini himself was arguably guilty of nearly every crime he took Houdin to task for. Harry Houdini's life story is riddled with mythology, exaggeration, and all-out deception. One source that really helped me crack this topic open was Joe Posnanski's The Life and Afterlife of Harry Houdini. In that book, the author dug up a letter written from Houdini biographer Lindsay Gresham to a fan. In that letter, Gresham lamented, quote, "Finding out the truth about a legend builder like Houdini is like trying to chew your way through a coconut." End quote. So, this is the task we have laid out in front of us, friends. We're going to try and chew through the coconut of Harry Houdini's life. But I think it's important that you understand going into this that the point of this series isn't to reveal all of Houdini's magical secrets. I'm not going to be going through all the big illusions and escapes and telling you how he did them. That's not the point. Now, there might be a few spots where revealing a trick might be material to the story, but for the most part, that's not what I'm doing here. As always, I'm trying to pick apart the historical misconceptions about Houdini. Houdini was a storyteller and a secret keeper, which has meant that despite being one of America's most famous entertainers, few know the man behind the myth. So, let's see what we can do about that. All right, so how did Eric Weiss become Harry Houdini? Well, let's take a look. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Shopify. Can we talk about notifications for a second? Who actually leaves those sounds on anymore? Well, besides that kind. That's another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run, and grow your business. Shopify makes it simple to sell to anyone from anywhere. Whether your thing is vintage t-shirts or recipes for ghee, start selling with Shopify and join the platform simplifying commerce for millions of your favorite businesses worldwide. With Shopify, you can create your own online store that fits your vibe, you can discover new customers, and grow the following that keeps them coming back. Shopify makes selling simple, so you can put yourself and your ideas out there. Whether your thing is making ebooks or earrings, Shopify makes your success possible. So, sign up for a free trial at shopify.com/fake. That's fake, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/fake to start selling online today. Shopify.com/fake. Houdini's life story is filled with legends and misdirections. This is especially true of his childhood. In 1910, Houdini wrote a piece that appeared in the magazine The Magical Annual. It was called simply Harry Houdini by Harry Houdini. It was presented as a candid autobiography written by a man who was by that time a living legend. The piece leads off, quote, "My birth occurred on April 6th, 1874, in the small town of Appleton in the state of Wisconsin." End quote. It turns out absolutely everything Houdini wrote in that first sentence was not true. Eric Weiss, the boy who would become famous as Harry Houdini, was not born in Appleton, Wisconsin. He was actually born in Budapest, Hungary, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was the son of Mayer and Cecilia Weiss, who were German-speaking Hungarian Jews. Eric Weiss didn't make a secret of the fact that his family had been Central European Jewish immigrants. In fact, many American Jews and other European immigrants saw Houdini as a real source of pride for their communities. Beyond changing his name, Eric Weiss didn't hide the fact that he was Jewish, which was somewhat rare at a time when anti-Semitic attitudes were extremely common. In a profile written in 1918, the author described him as a quote-unquote proud Jew. He even joked in that article that after a friend tried to convert him to Christianity, he went home, read the Bible, and, quote, "The next day I was a better Jew than I'd ever been in my life," end quote. Now, I bring this up because this was a time when Jewish performers often felt pressured to hide their religious and ethnic heritage. This was done out of a real fear that Christian American audiences would not accept them if they knew they were Jewish. Houdini lied prodigiously about the details of his life, but noticeably, he never lied about his Jewish heritage. But with that said, It's clear that it mattered to Houdini that he be perceived as American first and foremost. At the peak of his fame, he presented himself as a quintessentially American performer, especially when he was touring Europe. Houdini's act, after all, was primarily about freeing himself from bondage. He wanted to embody the American myth of freedom and liberty. The inconvenient fact that he was technically born in Budapest complicated this. So he did his best to scrub it from his history. Eric Weiss moved to Appleton, Wisconsin when he was 4 years old, and he would live there until he was 8. So his time in that town was actually quite brief. But interestingly, later in life, Houdini would often go out of his way to mention that Appleton was his hometown. He even used to sign autographs, Harry Houdini, Appleton, Wisconsin. Now, I would wager this is because Appleton, Wisconsin is the most stereotypically American-sounding place that could possibly exist. And his association with that town made him seem especially American. This fib about his place of birth also seems to have been one that he told the U.S. government. In 1903, Houdini ended up filing for a new passport application where he listed Appleton as his place of birth. After that point, Appleton was listed on all of his official documents. Similarly, after 1903, his birth date was always given as April 6, 1874. However, as Houdini expert Kenneth Silverman has demonstrated, his real birthday was March 24th, 1874. Now, why would Houdini alter his birthday on official documents by just a couple of weeks? It's really unclear. It may have been an honest mistake. But whatever the reason, the secret of Houdini's birthday was incredibly well kept. In fact, Houdini's real birth date wouldn't be confirmed until 1972, when the Society of American Magicians formally investigated the issue. So, right off the top, some of the most basic facts we have about the life of Eric Weiss were purposefully misrepresented by the man himself. Chewing through a coconut indeed. What is clear is that in 1876, Houdini's father, Mayer Weiss, immigrated to the United States and set about looking for work. In 1878, he secured himself a job as a rabbi in the newly built synagogue in the small town of Appleton, Wisconsin. It was then that he sent for his wife Cecilia and his 5 children, among them the 4-year-old Eric. The couple would go on to have 2 more children, making Eric Weiss the 4th of 7 kids. Now, there's a pretty amazing story about the circumstances of the Weisses' immigration to America. The story goes that while living in Budapest, Houdini's father had a run-in with a local aristocrat. We're told that the nobleman offended Mayer Weiss by hurling some nasty anti-Semitic slur in his direction. Weiss was simply not having it that day. So he challenged the man to a duel. He would not be harassed in the street merely for being Jewish, even by a man who was clearly from the Austrian upper crust. The aristocrat accepted the challenge, and the next day, the men met with swords. Details of the duel have been lost, but we're told that Mayer Weiss left the field unscathed, while his opponent was mortally wounded and later died of his injuries. After the man passed, Mayer Weiss got word that he hadn't just killed some random upper-crust anti-Semite. That man had been Prince Eric of the Habsburgs. He had just killed a member of the royal family. As such, Budapest was no longer safe. So he fled, first to London and then to America, where he eventually sent for his family. When Meir's fourth son was born, he commemorated the duel by naming him Eric. So, if we believe the tale, then Houdini was named after a Habsburg prince that his father killed in single combat. Ha! It's an awesome story. It comes down to us from Houdini's wife Bess and Houdini's younger brother, a magician who performed under the name Hardin. But these two are not always the most reliable narrators. As we will see throughout this series, Bess is often one of the main sources for many of the myths and legends about her husband. And the magician Hardin was just as invested in his brother's myth as anyone else. Every serious Houdini biographer I have read doubts the duel story. Kenneth Silverman, who is regarded as one of the best and most thorough Houdini biographers, doesn't even include it in his book. So I think that says something. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that a Habsburg prince named Eric, or anything else for that matter, was killed in a duel in Budapest in the early 1870s. And that's the kind of thing that wouldn't have gone unnoticed. Later in life, Houdini would spin all sorts of tales about being a magical kid or an escape artist from birth. In that same 1918 profile that I referenced earlier, Houdini told the following story. Quote, "When I was a small boy in Appleton, my mother used to bake apple pie. She would lock it in a pantry, and it would disappear. I was the guilty culprit. Apple pie is probably the only thing which would drive me to such desperate deeds, and even today, for a piece of my mother's apple pie, I would commit theft." End quote. In more elaborate versions of this tale, we're told that his mother would lock up her apple pie with a series of impenetrable locks, only to return later to find that the pie had been eaten, but all the locks were still miraculously in place. So, if we believe Houdini, then he was picking locks and making things disappear from boyhood. Now, it's impossible to test the truth of this story, but most of the Houdini biographers believe that this was just a little bit of self-mythologizing. I mean, it does seem suspiciously on brand for a man who would eventually become famous as an escape artist. It reminds me a little bit of the tale of baby Hercules strangling the snakes sent to kill him in his crib. But there is a kernel of truth at the heart of this story, and that is, it expresses Houdini's deep and enduring love for his mother, Cecilia. He would remain extremely devoted to his mother for his entire life. One thing that makes me particularly skeptical of the pie story is that Houdini came to the escape artist act a little bit later in his career. He was a performer long before he was a magician, and he was a magician long before he was an escape artist. You see, for all of Houdini's tales of an idyllic childhood in Appleton mischievously filching pies, the Weiss family struggled for years to make ends meet. They only remained in Appleton for 4 years because Mayor Weiss lost his job as the rabbi at the Appleton synagogue. Now, it's a little unclear why this happened. It's been suggested that the congregation wanted a younger rabbi. It's also been suggested that Rabbi Weiss never really mastered English and conducted his services in German. The Jewish community in Appleton may have wanted an English-speaking rabbi. Either way, after losing his job in Appleton, Mayor Weiss moved his family to Milwaukee and then eventually New York City. Along the way, he plied his trade as a sort of rabbi-for-hire. He could do weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs. He got work as a mohel performing circumcisions. But neither in Milwaukee nor New York did he find a permanent position at a synagogue. In practical terms, this meant that the Weiss family was always just scraping by. At times, the family struggled to put food on the table. Harry Houdini knew what it was like to grow up poor in America. But by all accounts, this made him into the hustler that he was. From a very young age, Eric Weiss was working, trying to supplement the family income. But he was also always performing. For years, he worked as a messenger boy and learned along the way that having a quick joke or a cute little routine got him better tips. But the first time he performed on stage that we know of was in Milwaukee at the age of 9. He performed as a contortionist and a trapeze artist in a type of kids' circus, where he was billed as Eric, Prince of the Air. Even as a kid, Eric Weiss was exceptionally athletic and would remain so for his entire life. Before he really dug into magic, Eric was a circus performer. Now, you might read that at the tender age of 12, Houdini ran away from home and joined the circus. This is only partially true. It definitely makes for a romantic start to the Houdini myth to have him running off and joining the circus. But the truth is more complicated. He definitely took off on his family at the age of 12 and hopped a train to Kansas City. But it seems like he returned pretty quickly. It is true that he would eventually become a circus performer, but it wasn't as simple as he turned 12, he hopped a train, he joined a circus, boom, he's a famous magician. Eric Weiss was 18 years old when his career started in earnest. It was arguably the 2 years between 1892 and 1894 that really changed his life. In 1892, Houdini's father, Rabbi Meir Weiss, passed away in New York City after a battle with tongue cancer. We're told that his last words to Eric were along the lines of, "Make sure your mother is provided for." Upon his passing, Cecilia apparently lamented in German, quote, "Weiss, Weiss, you have left me with your children. What have you done?" End quote. It seems like the young Eric Weiss took these words to heart, and he would spend the rest of his adult life doing his best to provide for his mother. But despite what must have felt like an enormous responsibility for an 18-year-old just coming into adulthood, it didn't stop Eric from pursuing a life in show business. By 1893, Eric Weiss had teamed up with his friend Jacob Hyman, and they had put together their first magic act as the Brothers Houdini. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, Hyman wouldn't last long as part of the duo, as he joined the army sometime in 1894. It was around this time that Eric became known as Harry. Friends and family had always called Eric Airy from his youth, and Airy steadily transformed into Harry. Once he started performing as a Houdini brother, he leaned into the pleasing alliteration of Harry Houdini. After Jacob Hyman left the act, Houdini performed for a little while with his younger brother Dezo Weiss, who everyone called Dash. And yes, Dash would remain a magician in his own right, and eventually transformed himself into the great Hardin. But in the summer of 1894, Harry Houdini would meet his true partner, both personally and professionally, Wilhelmina Beatrice Rauner, a talented young woman who everyone called Bess. How did Houdini and Bess get together? Well, of course, there's a bit of a story there. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll hear how Beatrice Rauner became Bess Houdini. If we believe the tale told by Beatrice Ronner, aka Bess Houdini, then her courtship with the young Harry was, well, nothing short of magic. And I know that's a groaningly obvious cliche, but the story told by Bess almost begs for those kinds of descriptors. Now, Bess would tell the story slightly differently over the course of her life, so I have to give you an approximation of the tale. Here it is. It was 1894, and the 18-year-old Beatrice Ronner was just finishing up high school. As an end-of-the-year treat for the students and their families, the school hosted a magic show. We're told that Bess's stern Catholic mother believed that magic was immoral and possibly even demonic. But she agreed grudgingly to allow her daughter to attend the show, so long as she, her mother, could accompany Bess as a chaperone. The magician performing that day was none other than a dashing 20-year-old Harry Houdini. Bess would describe herself as a total innocent at that time, a naive girl whisked away by the wonders being shown on stage by this handsome young magician. She and her mother were sitting close to the stage when suddenly Houdini, in a rare Butterfingers moment, dropped a flask of acid that he'd been using as part of one of his illusions. The acid spilt all over Beatrice's nice dress that she'd worn especially for the occasion, causing a huge stain. The embarrassed Houdini immediately rushed to the girl's side to make sure that she hadn't been hurt, tripping over himself to make apologies. Bess's mother was beside herself. She began publicly dressing down Houdini and even threatened to get the police involved. At this point, we're told that Bess leaned over to Houdini and whispered, "Don't mind, Mother. I think you're wonderful." To which a now smitten Houdini replied, "Do you?" Oh, that's what you call a meet cute, kids. In the end, Houdini was able to calm Bess's still furious mother by promising to replace the dress at his own expense. This was how Harry Houdini got Bess's address. We're told that 1 week later, Harry Houdini appeared at Bess's door with a beautiful pink dress, apparently handmade by Houdini's own mother, Cecilia. Bess took the dress, put it on, and then, without a word to her mother and father, slipped out the door and headed out for a date with Harry Houdini. And so the two starry-eyed kids headed off to the best possible spot for a first date in 1890s New York, Coney Island. The afternoon became the evening, and the smitten couple lost track of time. Eventually, Bess realized that she had stayed out too late. She would never make it back home in time for her curfew. Her parents would be furious. But to this, the impetuous young Houdini said, quote, "If you were my wife, they wouldn't dare punish you," end quote. And so, right there on the spot, they decided to get married. Houdini was broke, of course, and had no money for a ring. So we're told that they stopped into a pawn shop and Bess bought herself a wedding ring. But who would marry them on such short notice, and without the consent of Beatrice's parents? Luckily, they knew a guy. Somehow, they tracked down one John McCain, a corrupt local politician and construction magnate who had built Coney Island. McCain saw that these two crazy kids were in love, and so he pulled some strings, and before the night was through, the Houdinis were married. That was June 22nd, 1894. It's a wonderful story, and one that Bess stuck to until her passing in 1943. This was clearly how Bess Houdini wanted people to remember her romance with Harry. But Once again, Bess was clearly making a myth. As many Houdini biographers have discovered, the story falls apart pretty quickly as soon as you poke at it. First, Bess's characterization of herself as a naive girl who wasn't even allowed to see a magic show without her mother chaperoning was clearly an invention. In 1894, the 18-year-old Bess was already a performer in her own right. She was part of a song and dance group called the Floral Sisters, who were hitting the same small-time stages as the Houdini brothers in those days. The two almost certainly did not meet while Houdini was performing at her high school. Houdini's brother Dash would remember first meeting Bess after a show where they had shared a bill. In fact, Joe Posnanski has pointed out that Bess may have even dated Dash before she hooked up with Harry. Now, I'm not saying this to shame Bess Houdini in any way. I mean, live your life, my magic queen. But in more prudish times, when female behavior was more tightly constrained, Bess may have felt the need to create a courtship story that emphasized how chaste and obedient she'd been before Houdini swept her off her feet. Also, Coney Island boss John McCain couldn't have possibly arranged their marriage on June 22, 1894, because he was in jail at that time. Finally, what is up with this beaker of acid? What magic trick involves a beaker of acid? Anyway, as with many Houdini myths, there are a few kernels of truth at the heart of this story. Harry and Bess's courtship was a bit of a whirlwind. Now, trying to pin down the exact timeline is tricky, but it does seem like they were married within a month of having met each other. Also, Bess's mother did seem to be slow to accept Harry Houdini as a suitable match for her daughter. Not so much because he was a magician, but more so because he was Jewish. By all accounts, she eventually came around to her son-in-law, especially as he got famous. For her part, Cecilia Weiss never seemed overly concerned that her son had married outside of the faith, and was apparently very warm to Bess from the start. What is clear is that almost immediately, Bess became part of the magic act. It was at this point that the brothers Houdini finally died. Dash and Harry were able to amicably dissolve their magical partnership. The new act was a husband and wife routine dubbed simply the Houdinis. Now, this was when Harry and Bess really started to pay their dues as performers. They toured around the United States, mostly playing at cheap dime museums and a handful of circuses. This was when Harry Houdini really ran away and joined the circus, when he was a newlywed in his early 20s. But this era of his career really underscores how he was truly an entertainer first and a magician second. Now, don't get me wrong. From the time he started the Houdini Brothers act, magic was always a passion. But he and Bess did a ton of other stuff. While on the circus and dime museum circuit, Houdini did a Punch and Judy puppet routine. He played the part of a strongman. He did acrobatics. Bess sang, danced, and did a clown act. They even created a husband and wife stand-up comedy routine billed using Bess's maiden name as The Rawners, America's best comedy act. Harry even passed himself off as a human oddity in a freak show, performing as Prohea, the wild man of Mexico. Although biographer Kenneth Silverman tells us that this was short-lived after Harry got a black eye when an overly excited audience member threw a slab of raw meat directly at his face. There's paying your dues, and then there's injured by meat in a freak show paying your dues. You can't say that Houdini and Bess didn't earn everything they got. I bring this up not only because it's interesting, but because it seems like Harry and Bess just wanted to be in show business, whether that was as a magic act, comedians, dancers, or whatever. I can't help but wonder if their comedy routine had taken off, if we would have ever had Houdini the magician. But this is just an elaborate what if, because through all of that, the magic act was consistently the most successful of their endeavors. Their first real hit was an illusion they dubbed the Metamorphosis. Now, Harry Houdini sometimes gets credit for inventing this piece of stage magic, but that's simply not true. The inventor of this trick was an English magician named John Neville Maskelyne. Interestingly, Maskelyne is also credited with inventing England's first pay toilet, so there's that. Very early on in his magic career, Houdini was able to buy the specially designed trunk that Maskelyne had created for this illusion. Now, even though Houdini didn't invent this illusion, he did give it the snappy name Metamorphosis. He also made it his own by adding a level of speed and precision to its execution. Originally, Houdini performed this trick with his brother Dash, but it really started to get attention when he started performing it with Bess. This was because Bess could move fast. In fact, it's been guessed that one of the reasons that Bess replaced Dash in the Houdini Brothers act was because she was petite, only stood about 5 foot tall, she had a dancer's agility, and she was cute. All the things you want in a magician's assistant. More impressively, Houdini and Bess were able to perform the metamorphosis illusion in 3 seconds flat. How did the illusion go? Well, I'll let a magazine article from the era describe it. This is from one of the earliest write-ups we have of a Houdini show. The article described the illusion like this, quote, "To the audience and to the close inspection of the volunteers upon the stage, the time-worn trunk was shown, and its 4 sides, bottom, and cover well sounded to prove the absence of trickery. Next, the volunteers were given for examination a black flannel bag, 7 feet in length, a yard or so of tape, and some sealing wax. Houdini's next request was that his committee securely encase him in the previously examined sack. They tightly bound his mouth together with heavy tape already in their hands and secured the knots with sealing wax." End quote. From there, the magician was placed inside the trunk. The trunk was then padlocked and secured with even more ropes. Now, most of this illusion was just the show of Houdini being bound, gagged, and tied into a bag, then placed in a locked trunk. In front of the trunk, there was a curtain set up so it could be easily drawn back and forth. During the whole setup, the curtain had remained open, and the volunteers were free to inspect it at their leisure. With Houdini safely bound inside the trunk, the article continued, quote, "Mrs. Houdini, standing at the open curtain, makes the following announcement. Now then, I shall clap my hands 3 times, and the 3rd and last time I ask you to watch closely for the effect." At this, she rapidly closes the curtain and vanishes from sight, yet instantaneously the curtain is reopened, this time by Houdini himself. End quote. Boom. In the blink of an eye, Bess became Houdini. Then Houdini would make a big show out of unlocking the trunk and revealing Bess inside the bag, bound and gagged, just as Houdini had been moments ago. It's such a good illusion that magicians are still performing variations on it to this very day. In 1894, Metamorphosis was straight up mind-blowing. Not only did Metamorphosis get Harry and Bess some of their best early press, but it set the tone for the rest of Houdini's career. Even with the success of Metamorphosis, Houdini didn't rocket to fame overnight. But as he and Bess were grinding on the dime museum circuit, trying absolutely anything they could to entertain a crowd, they kept coming back to Metamorphosis. There was something deeply compelling about that illusion. If they could tap into the thing that made Metamorphosis so good, perhaps they could make an act that would really get the world's attention. Perhaps the key was escape. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will continue our series on Harry Houdini. Before we go this week, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Cecilia M., to Mark Shepherdson, to Eric Rodriguez, to Dietmar Lamberts, to Adam Grogan, to Chuck Cruz, to Nelson Figueroa, to Chris Johnson, to Megan McLeod, to Irina R.D., to Ralph Burris, to Jimmy Reamer, to Shaylin Sue, to Sander Mangle, to Marita Lee, to Chris Bombach, to Brett Pulliam, to Juan Shute, to Ray, to John Williams, to Michael Bogan, and to Sarah Clark. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more on Patreon every month. So you know what that means. They're beautiful human beings. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you to everyone that supports at all levels. Thank you to everyone that goes out there and writes nice 5-star reviews of the show. Thank you all just for your support. It means absolutely everything. If you're looking for ways to support the show, you can always go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and find the level of support that works for you. Like I said at the top of the show, I've got a new extra coming out probably within the week on that ridiculous Graham Hancock series, Ancient Apocalypse. I really don't hold back. I try to be pretty even-handed on the main feed here, but I get a little salty on the extra, so if you want to hear that, please start supporting on Patreon at $3 or more. You can also get Our Fake History merch at our TeePublic store. Go to teepublic.com/store/our-fake-history, or just go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can send me an email. That's ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Twitter at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory, and you can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. As always, the theme music for our show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can find more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
Hi, this is Jillian. Those of us here at Court Junkie have a new podcast called Civil, where we dive into fascinating civil cases. Like in the case of a principal who took it upon himself to hypnotize students as a hobby. Then many of those students ended up dead. Or when a man was publicly and wrongfully accused of being the I-10 freeway shooter. We'll also be covering popular civil cases you've likely heard of, like O.J. Simpson and Alex Jones versus the parents of Sandy Hook.
This is AC. I have O.J. in the car.
Sandy Hook, it's got inside job written all over it.
Hosted by me, Jillian Jalali, researched by Nicole Gusmarati, and written by Matt Stroud and Nick Kepler. If you like following criminal trials like I do, I think you will love Civil. Subscribe to us now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.